Let us continue with our lesson. And on the previous lesson, we have learned about the three major components about the room. And so let's go to our application and let us make use of this component. So let's go to the section app over here and let's go to the Java package and open your package. And let's go to the model. We have in the model we have a local. Inside this local we have a app preference, and let me add a new package over here, and we will call this as a entity. So enti by entity, and just click on OK. And we will also add the another package over here, which should be of a DAO. So we have a DAO, and let me add another package over there, which should be of a DB. So the database. So I have created a three package over here that we previously saw, three core component: database, entities, and a DAO. So let me go back to the application. So first of all, we will work with the entities. So let me create a new what we will do is I will go over to the remote section, and in the response we will first make use of the to do and the task response. So let's make use of a task response. So we have the data class over here, and what we can do from here is that we can just copy this, all of this. We will need all of this, right? Or first of all, let's not copy. I think let's create a new Kotlin class, and we can call this as a tax entity. So tax entity. So let me call it as a tax enti tax entity. Enti, I think that should be correct, right? So enti entity, and we have a tax entity. And okay, so let me add this one, and over here instead of this one class, it should be of a data class. So data class, and whenever we have a data class, we must have a constructor with a value that we need. So let me go back to this particular task response, and let me copy all of this. And now let me go to the entity, and let me just paste it this one. I'll just cancel it because we are not going to serialize it. So let me remove the serialized name from here because we are not working with the JSON data, so I don't need to serialize it. And so let me remove this one. And the first thing that we have to take note is if you go to particular over here, so whenever we create an entity class, so data class we have created, right? And we have added some of the properties over here. The first thing is that we need to annotate it with the entity. So let's go back to the application, and this class is an entity, so I need to annotate it with the entity. So you can see Android X room. So we must annotate it with the entity. That makes that okay. So whenever the room try to access this one, it says okay, this is an entity. And later when we create a database object over here, that time we have to specify this particular entity that we have annotated over here. And the next thing is that we have to have an ID. So that should be of a val ID, and we can take it as a long, and by default I can give it as a 0. Yeah, sorry. Okay, I have an ID already over here, so let me remove that one. And it should be of L. And okay, so I will remove that one. So first we have an ID body created add. We don't need this one. So things that you don't need you can remove from here. So what I need is ID body. So let me try to arrange this one. So it should be at the, I think after ID I should have a title, right? After title I have the body, and after body I have status and user ID and the color, right? So I think that should be fine. And since we entered this one, the entity, and the next thing is that we need a primary key. So we can set this ID as a primary key and an auto increment. So what we can do is, let me create a primary key. So I can make use of annotation at primary key. So we have annotation of primary key, and here we can pass the parameter of auto generate, which is of true. So when we say that auto generate equals to 2, that means that this ID will be auto generated every time. So whenever we insert a new record, it will auto generate ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So all of this will be auto generated, so we don't have to mention it. And I give a default value over here as a 0. So later when we use tax entity over in our application, we don't have to explicitly mention this default value, because it's a default, it has a default value. So we can just make use of these particular properties instead of the ID. And also the next thing that we can do over here, this, since we are inserting the tags, first we are getting the response, and later we will insert this response to our database. So we have an ID, and we should also have a tax response ID. So if we want to later track back that this tax belongs to which particular ID in our API or in the backend server. So the backend server ID and your database ID may be different, or it may be changed, or it may have a different ID, so it may not match. So that's why we need to also maintain one of the ID. We will also maintain one of the ID for our tags. So for that, what I will do is I will make use of a val, and I will call this one as a tax ID. I think that should be better. So I will call it as a tax ID, and this should be of a let me call it long or int. So we are getting in the integer value, so it should be of a int, and that should be fine. So we have a tax ID and the tax ID. So tax ID is the response ID that we are getting. We will set that one, and this ID is the auto generate for our database, which will be of a primary key. And now these are the columns of our table, right? Entity is the table of our database, right? So these are our column. So what we need to do is we need to annotate this one as a column. So for that, I can say add column, COL, column info. We have a column info, and this takes a parameter over here, which is of a name. So first parameter we can give it as a name over here, and name we can just say this is a database table schema name. So I can make it as a, sorry, not the single quote, it should be on the double quote. Okay, column info. Now when this means that this is our column info for our table. So this is the entity. We have a table of a tax entity over here, and now this column info specifies this is our table column. So this is our column in our table. So we need to annotate for all of these. We need to annotate this column info for all of our properties over here in order to make it as a column in our table. So we can just copy this whole thing and just paste it over here, and let's do for all of this stuff and all of our properties over here. And now let's change the name. So this should be of the title, right? And this should be of the body column info. This is of status, right? And this is of the user ID, and this is of our bg color. So we have it. And now when you say the entity, this will be marked as the entity. But if you doesn't provide any parameter over here, that means by default whenever the database generates the table name for it, it will make use of the tax entity, whatever we have said over here. But if you want to provide a name, we can add a parameter over here. So we can add an entity parameter. So first we can give it as a table name. So table name, we can specify what will be the table name for this entity. So I can just copy this tax entity and paste it over here and make it as a tax entities. So this is, then let me say as a tax and underscore entities. So that should be the one that we can set up. So something doesn't look correct, so let me remove this one. Okay, so we have created a table name with a tax entity and we have explicitly mentioned over here. And this is also good practice that when we create an entity, we should provide a constructor with a table name, because if you later minify your application, now if you go to the Gradle build and if you enable your minify enable and use a ProGuard, then this class will definitely be changed. The class name will be definitely changed, and when the database is generated, it will not be able to find this particular class for your entity. So it's better, or a good practice, that we give entity a table name in our entity annotation with a parameter for our database table name. So that should be a good practice. So I think that's all. So we have created a one entity for our table over here, which is tax entity, right? And let's meet up in the next lecture. On the next lecture, we'll go and create a DAO, or a data access object. Let's meet up in the next lecture. Till then, have a great day.